Welcome to Uncommon Knowledge. I'm Peter Robinson. By the way, be sure to join us on Facebook at facebook.com/UNC Knowledge. Facebook.com/UNC Knowledge. Mitchell Elias Daniels Jr. is the 49th governor of Indiana. A graduate of North Central High School in Indianapolis, of Princeton University, and of the Georgetown Law School, Mr. Daniels served as an assistant to Mayor of Indianapolis and then United States Senator Richard Lugar. In the Reagan White House, where we met, Mr. Daniels served as political liaison to the president. In the George W. Bush White House, Mr. Daniels served for 2 years as director of the Office of Management and Budget. Mr. Daniels was elected governor of Indiana in 2004 and then re-elected in 2008. In both campaigns, he crisscrossed the state, riding in an RV or on a Harley-Davidson and visiting every one of Indiana's 92 counties at least 3 times. Re-elected in 2008, he won more votes than any other candidate in the history of Indiana. Mitch, what model Harley?
Well, there are 2.
Oh, you've got 2?
Yeah. There's an 04 lowrider, it's called, which is now painted to look like the state flag. Sort of the official bike of the state. And then there's a black 2008 Fat Boy.
Good. You live well. The weekend edition of the Wall Street Journal. Front page. The governor who cut his state down to size. Mr. Daniels cut spending, trimmed the state workforce to its smallest in decades, and turned a yawning deficit into a surplus with only scattered outbursts of popular anger along the way. He has emerged from all this with high marks from voters. How'd you do it?
Oh, it was very mysterious. I hate to give away secrets, but for you I will. We spent less money than we took in. It's an old, somewhere said, tribal ritual out in Indiana. Not to be too flip about it, it wasn't that easy. We did have an extraordinarily tightest state budget in 55 years. Spending for the 6 years that we've been on the job in Indiana is the lowest, I think, in the country. Spending growth, that is, less than 1%, which is about 1/3 the rate of inflation. So we just put the brakes on spending very, very hard.
And you had, in Indiana, the legislature is called the General Assembly.
Right.
You've got 2 houses, but together they're called the General Assembly.
That's right.
You had Republican majorities in 4 years of your 6? Is that correct?
Well, not yet. The first 2, and then for the last month we've had that again. But for the intervening 4 years, it was a divided legislature, which our Democratic friends were in charge of the House. Another indispensable tool, Peter, was that the legislature, whether Republican or divided, was kind enough to delegate to the governor the opportunity to reduce spending if revenues disappointed, which they did in a huge way. And we've used that authority really vigorously.
Essentially an impoundment authority or a rescission authority?
Which, incidentally, I've argued would be something that would be useful to restore it. Presidents of the United States once had such an authority. And I think if we're ever going to get that squared away, it'd be a very nice implement for their toolbox. But anyway, it was between very successful, I would say, cooperation on the budgets we got, and then aggressive action every single day to look for ways to stretch dollars and spend even fewer than they voted for. We got out of bankruptcy into a strong enough position to ride through the recent difficulty without a tax increase. We're basically the only state not sitting on a lot of oil, gas, or something energy related to have done that. And
music to the ears of a Californian, where we're facing $29 billion deficit over 2 years. You cut property taxes but raised sales taxes. Why do you prefer property taxes to sales taxes? I mean, why do you prefer keeping those low?
Well, we thought we were out of balance. We thought our property tax system was working a hardship on homeowners, on senior citizens, and even on our business sector, and it was growing very fast. And so it's important to know this was the biggest tax cut in state history. So the revenue that a penny of sales tax raised was offset almost 2 to 1 by the cuts in property taxes. And on top of that, we capped property taxes, and now we've made this constitutional. So just to eat your California heart out, if you came to Indiana, as you ought to do really, bought a house, it would not only cost you a lot less, you would never pay more than 1 cent on the dollar of market value maximum to own that home in property taxes.
Education. Andy Ferguson, in his Weekly Standard cover story about you, appeared this past summer, quote, school funding increased. You've been talking about everything you've cut. School funding increased every year under Daniels before the recession, and since the downturn, when most areas of state government have seen cuts of 25% or more, education has been reduced by 2%.
Yeah, that's correct. It's unknown to most Hoosiers, and unfortunately I think to most Indiana educators, but we looked recently, and Indiana, by a clear margin, devotes a higher percentage of its state government, over 50%, to K-12 than any other state in the Union. So we have protected education funding about as well as I think we could have.
You're not opposed to government. You believe there are certain essential functions, and in state governments, education is the primary function.
Public safety is probably the primary function, but right behind it. Yes, we think public education. Now that's a function, which leads to a different set of arguments. The function is to see that the children are educated. How we do that is something honest people can differ about. The function is not to create a system, however, which I think over the years some people have confused means with ends.
Mm-hmm. Briefly, while we're still talking about your time as governor, you've got a couple of measures pending before the General Assembly right now, which I'd like to touch on just briefly. Quoting a speech you gave earlier this month, before our current legislature adjourns, we intend to become the first state of full and true school choice.
Yes. We've already achieved a situation in which any family that can manage it can enroll their child in a different public school district, cross district lines, no tuition.
When you say they can manage it, they're going to have to drive the child back and
They
forth?
might.
Okay.
They might.
All right.
And during this General Assembly, we were trying to dramatically expand charter schools, which is another very important form of choice. And then finally, for low and moderate income families who still aren't confident they found the right a public option, either traditional or charter, a scholarship that they can take to the non-government school that they prefer.
You're not using the word voucher.
I could. That's a common term for it. That's what it is. But I prefer to think of it as a scholarship that the money really is for the child and for the child's education. This is the point I was referring to earlier. The responsibility of the state is to try to make certain that every child can have a high-quality education, but we trust families to decide for themselves where that can best be achieved for their child.
Last item while we're talking about your time as governor, again quoting from the speech you gave in February, my proposal for again pending before your current General Assembly, my proposal for an automatic refund of tax dollars beyond a specified level of state reserves.
Yeah. In a way, you can think of this as a very flexible spending limitation, but the idea simply is that we would decide when budgets are balanced and a sufficient savings account has been set aside, and that I'm open to what that is. Is it 10% of the year's budget? Is it 12%? But beyond some point that we'd agree on, automatically any revenues left over beyond that would go back to the taxpayer. I think it would create a healthy incentive for future legislators to stop spending at some point so they could give at least a small refund to everybody.
Segment 2, the Red Menace. The governor of Indiana speaking in February to the Conservative Political Action Conservative Political Action Conference, quote, "The American project is menaced by a survival-level threat. We face an enemy lethal to liberty and even more implacable than those America has faced before. We cannot deter it. We cannot negotiate with it. It is the new Red Menace."
Well, maybe it's overheated, and I hope, by the way, that I'm wrong. I hope the point is exaggerated.
Whatever it is, you got the nation's attention. The press really responded.
I keep hoping that someone wise will come up and say, "Now, Mitch, wait a minute. You've overlooked this or this or this. This is this problem of debts piling up to levels, the sort of Greece-like levels, or in prospect out there, is nothing to worry about. It's going to work out for the following reasons." I haven't found that person yet. You know, Peter, my view is, and I think I said it in that talk, I've said it frequently, this is not, to me, at bottom, a philosophical argument. It's an arithmetic one. And so I say to people who believe in a lot bigger government, more intrusive government than I do, let's have that debate tomorrow. For tonight, can we agree that the mathematics does not work here? The machine will go tilt, and we'll all pay a terrible price, regardless of our...
When you say...
Yeah.
Here's what's in my back of my mind. Back of my mind is George W. Bush. You were back home in Indiana by this point, but George W. Bush devoted more or less the first 18 months, almost 2 years of his second term, to talking about the danger of Social Security going bankrupt. It was going to go bankrupt in some X number of years out, and he got nowhere.
Yeah.
And so, as a layman watching all this happen, I assume that one reason he got nowhere was that it did all seem so far out and so abstract. How do you make concrete to people what's going to happen? You talk about a survival level threat.
Yeah.
What actually will go wrong, and when will it start to go wrong? When will we feel it?
It could happen gradually, but it also could happen all at once and fairly soon. There's a great little line from Hemingway that people have been exhuming lately, where the characters ask, "How'd you go broke?" And he said, 2 ways, gradually and all at once. You can't exclude, I hope this is remote, but you can't exclude that there'd be a sudden run on the dollar, loss of confidence, a la Lehman Brothers, for instance.
Right.
And in a wired world, this thing could happen very, very
You could have
quickly.
you could have a meltdown that would make the meltdown of 2008 look minor.
Sure. But let's just exclude that for a moment.
All right.
It is there. I don't know at this point of anybody, regardless again their view of political philosophy, who believes that you can run any enterprise, private, public, small, large, with the kind of debt levels that we're headed for with absolute certainty. Sooner or later, your creditors run you. And so, there's all sorts of evidence that we'll have a permanently stunted economy, that the American dream of upward mobility, of one's children doing better than you did, will perish. And that'll lead, I think, to a loss of liberty. It'll certainly lead to a loss of influence in the world. It'll lead to much less national security than we probably really want to have. And so I think it's a problem we all share, whatever our differences on other questions. And again, I'm waiting, hopefully, for someone to tell me to calm down, and not as bad as I think.
So unemployment in Spain right now, 20%.
Yeah.
1 in 5 workers looking for a job can't get one. In Ireland, it's moving up in that direction. In Greece, the numbers are unreliable, but something like that, if not worse. That could happen here.
I don't know how it doesn't happen if we wind up where those countries did in terms of the money they owe. So much of the entire substance of the economy going just to pay the interest on the bills you ran up in the past. So.
Okay. Let me quote you again, Mitch. Again, this is your CPAC speech. We know what the basic elements of reform must be. Sunsetting the major welfare programs of the last century when those currently or soon to be enrolled have passed from the scene. The creation of a new Social Security and Medicare compacts with the young. Sunsetting Social Security, the revered program, 7 decades old, given to us by the great father of us all, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Mm-hmm. You haven't just touched the third rail of American politics. You have given it a body hug.
Well, first of all, I chose that word carefully. It doesn't, for a moment, disparage the system we've had to say that it may have worked great for a long, long time, but it may not work well going forward. You know, you asked me earlier, why should we believe that any of these things can occur? I'll give you some reasons for optimism. One of them is that dividing the programs, whether it's Social Security or Medicare, saying to those who are counting on them now or will in 10 years or 15 years, don't worry about a thing. A deal is a deal. You're good to go. That you're going to have exactly the program that you expected. But you say to the young people who are getting the massive shaft in this country the way we're headed right now, they are paying for today's retirees. Some people haven't caught on to that yet, but they are. today's workers pay for yesterday's workers.
Right.
And they have no prospect at present of anything remotely equivalent waiting for them when they get to their elderly years. So here's the reason for optimism. You know, tens of millions of Americans have been through this already. Business after business over the last 10 or 20 years has come to the conclusion that the existing pension system or the existing health care system that they had, health insurance system, was going bust. And so they left it in place for those past a certain point, but they started a new plan. It's not radical. What would be radical and tragic would be to just leave this thing on autopilot, take everybody off a cliff.
Speech to CPAC again. You proposed a couple of good ideas. You quoted them as good ideas. One would be a new tax system. Again, to quote you, lower and flatter and completely flat is best. Now, you know politics as well as anybody, so I don't really need to remind you, but I will, that when Jerry Brown ran for the Democratic presidential nomination against Bill Clinton on a flat tax, he got wiped out. And when Steve Forbes ran for the GOP nomination on a flat tax, he registered 2 and 3% in polls with a margin error of 3 or 4%. Got nowhere. So you are arguing, is this, I'm probing here, I just want to know are you saying here's something toward which we should aim as an ultimate idea, the way Milton Friedman would just say, look, I know this isn't practical, but someday maybe? Or are you saying circumstances have changed, there's an opening?
Yeah. Well, this is interesting. First of all, I'm going to back up a half step to catch up quickly. Circumstances, I believe, have changed. Let's go back to the debt issue. And could you really talk about changing the so-called entitlement programs?
The third rail.
Why now? Why when President
George Bush got nowhere?
Right. One reason might be that we've had this little intervening event, a terrifying recession associated with debt, and everybody knows it. And almost every American either had a personal, up-close and personal encounter with debt, or their family member did, or their neighbor did, or the business they were in did. And I think we'll have a permanent change in outlook from folks who have looked in the mirror and thought to themselves, you know, Grandpa was onto something when he said, don't borrow too much. So now, let me switch back to the simpler, lower, flatter tax.
Right.
You know, there's also, this one I think is a whole lot easier, and you'll remember, I spent a great deal of my time in my service to President Reagan out advocating lower, flatter taxes. The rates came way down.
And we got them. The 86 reform worked.
That's
it did
right.
happen, yes.
That's right. And I'll also mention that this is one item on which I think economists across the spectrum, right to left, seem to agree that a more neutral system is first of all more fair, but the most important thing, and the reason it was in that speech, is if we can do all the reforming that I might dream about. We can cut the federal government down in all the ways that we should. But if this economy does not grow
There's no
at a very rapid rate, and for years without much of a hiccup, we just cannot catch up to the debts that we've piled up. And that's the main reason. And I think if you argued it to Americans, first on the basis that it would be simpler, a lot of us could resume paying our own taxes again, which only a minority. What an embarrassment that in our society, a dwindling minority of people can cope with the voluntary tax system. Not only be better in that respect, but that the main point would be more jobs and more hope going forward, and every economist around agrees with that. You might have a chance.
Okay. So the answer is you're serious. You're serious. You want to get this stuff done now. Well, we'll come to that. We'll come to that.
Did I act like I was joking?
Segment 3, what does he mean by that? You spoke at CPAC, Conservative Political Action Conference, in February. Chris Wallace just today called you the it boy. David Brooks has said you ought to run. George Will said you have the low-key charisma of competence. I love that phrase. Front page, here we are, of the Wall Street Journal, this weekend edition. And so your old friend Robinson's been looking around the conservative web, and people are more than interested. But there are a few questions. So let me put them to you.
Yeah.
Give you a chance to answer questions folks are raising. Value added tax. At CPAC in February, you advocated flat tax, but when you spoke at the Hudson Institute in October, you quoted Hudson's founder, the remarkable intellect, a great man in my judgment, Herman Kahn, who said, this is you quoting Herman Kahn,
Yeah.
quote, "It would be most useful to redesign the tax system to discourage consumption and encourage savings and investment. One obvious possibility is a value-added tax and flat income tax." Close quote. And then you added, this is your words, "that might suit our current situation pretty well."
Yeah.
Close quote.
Well, you know, I'm not for a VAT tax. I was extemporizing that night. I was making really 2 points. That the Hudson Institute I knew and loved was really famous for its contrarian thinking. And it operated on the premise that by the time everybody agrees on something, it's probably wrong, and let's go figure out why. And I was really commending the fact that way back then, he was talking about getting way, down to something much flatter on the income tax, taxing consumption, as opposed to work and investment and so forth. This is vintage Ronald Reagan, by the way.
Right, it sure
And
is.
so, I probably, trying to make that point, left an impression, I think a VAT tax is a good idea. I don't.
It's unambiguous. You are not in favor of flat
No, of
tax.
course not. Now,
Okay.
but let me just point out
Sure.
that a very flat income tax, the kind I described in that
Right.
speech, I specifically mentioned, don't tax investment and so forth. But if you do that, it works out pretty much like a consumption tax.
Right.
You just call it something different. But the whole point it was to say that on that one evening, let's keep thinking, let's keep our brains turned on, let's see if there are some new ideas, regardless of the subject matter, and that's all I had in mind.
Okay, collective bargaining. On your first day as governor, you reversed an executive order that a Democratic predecessor had signed granting collective bargaining rights to state employees. That happened 6 years ago. Happened, you're on the record. And then in February, you opposed a right-to-work measure that your own folks, the Republicans in your own legislature, were advocating. And boy, was there consternation on conservative websites. What does Governor Daniels think he's doing?
Yeah. Well, better question is what the right-to-work people think they were doing.
All right.
I don't necessarily oppose a right-to-work bill. In fact, I've been saying for years that this is something Indiana needs to look at. It does cost us jobs. We've been doing very, very well, but
because people can set up shop in Mississippi or South Carolina.
Here's an example. We have been working relentlessly to make our state a more pro-growth, pro-business place, and we've come to the top of everybody's ranking. Go look at any of them: Forbes,
Right.
Fortune, Site Selection Magazine, whatever it is. And the one box we cannot check is the right-to-work box. When we get a competitive opportunity, when we're aware of a business who is looking around for a place to invest, and we get a chance to show them Indiana, our success record for 6 years is 90%. But we also know that there's about a quarter of the opportunities that won't look at us for this one reason. So I have been openly said that this is a legitimate subject. But here's the problem. We worked very hard with an open and explicit agenda of, you would have to say, conservative change, and won an election. And I've been very excited about achieving these things. Some we've talked about here: the automatic refund to taxpayers,
school choice,
the biggest school choice opportunity in America, cutting the corporate income tax rate to bring in more jobs, sweeping reform of criminal justice and local government and so forth. Into this very packed and sometimes controversial picture came the idea out of nowhere of a right-to-work bill. No one had campaigned on it, not the legislators who brought it in. They had not gone to their people of their districts or the state and said, this is what we should do and why. And I said, why don't you bide your time? There's a better way, develop the case, and maybe next year. I was very afraid tactically of exactly what happened. This provided the pretext for our Democrats to repair to a hot tub in Illinois.
They pulled to Wisconsin. They skedaddled from the whole state.
That's right. And that entire agenda, which these critics you're talking about, if they were aware of it, I think they'd probably be enthusiastic about everything we were on the brink of doing. Right to work never had a chance. It probably has, by the way, their chances in Indiana have probably been reduced by the sudden surprise move that they made. And in the meantime, they have jeopardized one of the most ambitious, it's fair to say, conservative agendas in the country. So it was a terrible, at best, it was a terrible bit of judgment on the part of those who plowed ahead anyway.
Okay. Segment 4, what does he mean by that? Continued. The truce. Last summer, you told Andy Ferguson, doing a profile for you for the Weekly Standard, quote, the next president would have to call a truce on the so-called social issues, close quote. Now let me read to you a couple of sentences from Bill McGurn, Wall Street Journal columnist, friend. Quote, the aggression on social issues today emanates mostly from the left, whose preferred vehicle is a willing judge inflicting his private social preferences on the law. Anyone who believes a Republican call for a truce will end this is living in a dreamland. A far better way to unite Republicans and independents and Tea Partiers would be to talk about returning these hot-button issues to where they belong, the states and the localities acting through the people's elected governors and legislators. Close quote. You got Bill McGurn angry, that's for sure.
Well, he may be right. I don't want to argue with anybody about this. You know, one of the ironies is, you look at what I've said, and in my case, done. I'm in complete agreement with most of those who were
Well, let's talk about that. You have a pro-life record.
Yeah, and unlike a lot of people, I've just talked about it. We have actually passed legislation to, in essence, make it more informed. The choice that the law currently requires more informed in Indiana. Abortion clinics were not regulated till I ordered it in Indiana, and so we've taken those steps. You don't take it from me. You can check with the Right to Life organizations. They've never had, they will tell you, a governor so pro-life. So it's not that I disagree at all with these folks, and I don't want to have an argument about it. Bill may well be right. It was simply a tactical suggestion that goes back to the premise we discussed earlier. If you don't believe that the American Republic is mortally threatened, as I do, by this one overriding problem we have built for ourselves, then of course I'm wrong. And but if that is the case, then all I was really saying was, I don't want to lose one person. You keep talking about how hard it's going to be, and it is, to make the kind of changes that will restore America's greatness. And all I was saying was, we're going to need to unify all kinds of people, and we're going to need freedom is going to need every friend it can get if we're going to do these things. And that's, but look, the folks who have taken exception,
they're your friend.
And I'm theirs, and I respect them. And
all right, so let me ask one more question on this truce idea, because this again is everybody. This is everywhere. So let's give you a chance just to address it. The next president, whoever that might be, is very likely to face a vacancy on the Supreme Court. Now, if that next president were following your advice,
wouldn't make a bit of difference. Has nothing to do with that.
In other words, does a truce mean that you let Cass Sunstein and Larry Tribe give you you choose somebody from the Federal Society? What the heck does a truce mean?
Well, if I'm the one who used the word, am I entitled to decide what I was talking about?
Sure you are. Yes.
Yeah. Yes. Well, first of all, it was addressed to both sides. Mm-hmm. Mr. McGurn was quite right. I've said the same thing many times. The aggression right now comes from those who are trying to, change our social arrangements by judicially or somewhere from the other side. But this has nothing to do with one of the deepest convictions that I have is about strict construction of constitutions. It goes to the heart of our rule of law. I've only had 3 shots to appoint judges in Indiana. We have one of those systems in which I am sent a panel, and I have appointees to the panel, so they know what I'm looking for. And fortunately, I've always had the opportunity so far. I've selected 3 of the most rock-ribbed, unimpeachably strict constructions judges Indiana has seen. That's a non-negotiable item with me, and I hope, that next president, whoever that may be,
All right.
will have that same viewpoint.
Defense. 2 quotations. One, you at CPAC, quote, "Nothing, not even our national defense can get a free pass. We are currently borrowing the entire defense budget from foreign investors. That is not, as our military friends say, quote, a robust strategy," close quote. Item 2. This is almost a dirty trick because I know you and I feel the same way about him. Quotation 2, Ronald Reagan.
Mm-hmm.
Quote, "Defense is not a budget issue. You spend what you need."
Well, if you have it, if you have it, I said in the very same speech, I've served in 2 administrations that practiced the policy of peace through strength. It is, I think, inarguable historically that it worked.
Right.
And it was the appropriate policy, and it always will be. But we have not been in this bind before. We have not been as broke as we are or are about to be. And it is absolutely inevitable if we do not tackle the deficit and debt problems, defense will get strangled anyway. I said if we don't get on top of this, we'll have a lot less strength, and eventually we may not have peace.
All right. Fighting war in Afghanistan, much of the Middle East aflame, China expanding its military dramatically. Let me quote to you Hillsdale political scientist and Ricochet contributor Paul Ray. Our fiscal crisis is not the only particular we must address. The Chinese are behaving like bullies. I also believe we're witnessing a strategic shift in the Mediterranean. The younger generation is turning to the only cultural force that has purchase in the post-Cold War world. They are turning to Islam. Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, Jordan, Bahrain, these states are likely to become more hostile to us. What does Mitch Daniels know about any of this? We have no indication. Close quote.
Yeah. Well, I'm not utterly new or naive to these things. The work of Hudson Institute was all about national security.
And as OMB director, didn't you? You had a seat on the National Security Council.
Yes, in fact. And Senator Lugar, in the years I worked for him, was on the Foreign Relations Committee. So that's, I don't want to overclaim, but it's not as though I've not paid attention. As a lot of folks do, Peter, you left out of the introduction the 15 most important years of my life, my years in business, which included going all over the world on behalf of one company, actually 2, and seeing a lot of things in a way that you may not get sitting on a college campus, reading people's journal, reading learned journals. So I'm not going to have a credentials argument here, but I will just say this: that once again, if we do not restore the vitality of the American economy, if we do not, in the process, get on top of our debt so that we are not the beggars of the world, the professor there, he won't have an answer either as to what you do about the Mediterranean or the Chinese. Chinese won't have to threaten us militarily. It was called the bonds.
All right. Segment 5, final segment. The man on the Harley. You've worked for 2 presidents, Ronald Reagan and George W. Bush. You're a student of American history. Who are your heroes? In American history, who are your heroes?
Oh, so I can't start with Duke Snyder.
I wanted to cut that one off right away.
Yeah. Washington. And in American history, Washington, and this one will surprise you because it surprised me, U.S. Grant. Wouldn't have told you that till a few years ago, but I've been reading a lot more about him, and he was underestimated both as a general and as a man. Teddy Roosevelt with qualifications. And Eisenhower. And Eisenhower.
And Eisenhower.
Eisenhower for sure.
Okay, you just named 4 tough hombres. I'm trying to find the theme here. You just named 4 men's men, strong figures, figures of action, people who got things done. Have I identified the theme there?
Yeah, well, how many people
you
do you
look
have?
at accomplishment.
How many people have weenies for heroes? I mean,
All right. David Brooks in the New York Times. In early February, Governor Mitch Daniels of Indiana met with a group of college students. He told them there is an excellent chance he will not run for president. This is the GOP quandary. The man who would be the party's strongest candidate for the presidency is seriously thinking about not running. Daniels and Obama could have a great and clarifying debate. What exactly are the paramount problems facing the country? What is the government's role in solving them? I, says David Brooks, hope Daniels gives us a chance to be part of that. Close quote. Well, how are you going to decide?
First, you need to know that I visited with those students because none of whom I'd ever met. They somehow spontaneously had gotten together in the social media way people do now, and on 50-some campuses had these organizations asking me to do
Oh,
this.
really?
Yes, and so I found out that a large number of them were going to be at that place where I gave the speech, and I didn't want to come and go without thanking them. I'll tell you what I told them. I did say that, you know, as I've said to many others, I've not decided not to do this, but I certainly have not decided to run for office, national office. Had never really thought about that till recently. What I wanted them to know is how much I appreciated, first of all, their confidence, and that I urged them, in the event I didn't run, I said, you've got to rebrand and keep moving forward. It's the young people of America whose interests are most threatened by the mistakes that we continue to make or the problems we continue not to address. And so that's why I was visiting with them and gave them an honest assessment. Yeah, very well may not. You know, Peter, we go back. And
could I just back? We do go back. So there you were, president of North American operations at Eli Lilly, one of the finest companies, best places to work, most admired corporations, year after year after year. Lilly ranks right up there. You had a huge job, 30,000 people overseeing them, operations on an entire continent. You were making very good money. Forget about running for president. I don't understand why you stepped down to run for governor.
Well, of course I didn't. I got a phone call and then another and asking me to come into the Bush 43 administration.
Right.
And
but you could have gone back to Lilly, or go ahead.
And that's what I thought I'd do. Life led in a different way. But even after I surprised myself and agreed to run for governor of Indiana, never ever thought beyond that. I thought it would be a useful thing. I saw my state not just slipping sideways but sinking, and I thought that, and a lot of us thought, that we ought to organize ourselves and go try to make the place a better state, a more prosperous state for those who came after. And that's all I ever set out to do, was 4 years, maybe 8 years, working hard on that, and that's what I've been doing.
So let me put it to you the other way around. You made some good money at Lilly. You're term limited as governor. Why wouldn't you run for president? You're confident enough, as best you could say to yourself, you could sort of think of it in terms of offering yourself to the American people. Here are the issues you care about. Here's what you know how to do. You see the budget as a red menace. If enough folks agree with you, you'll take the job.
Peter, two things. I mean, one is, aside from those who really just have an incredible personal obsession or passion with it, you know, it is an incredible undertaking. And not just for you, but you drag your family along with you. Right. It's a savage jungle out there. I hope we're going to change this eventually. It's something else I've appealed to folks that agree with us on most things is, you know, let the other side be the people with the hate speech. You know, you can't outdo them anyway. But for the moment, it is a very, very awful endeavor, and not something to be done lightly, at least by someone who has always thought of public service as something that where a citizen pays rent to this wonderful nation of ours, someone once said. Go and do your service and go back to your plow. And that's what I've always intended to do, and it's not, you don't just lightly toss that aside and take this on.
Last question, whether you run or not, here's the last question. James Glassman, writing in the Wall Street Journal a couple of weeks ago, quote, "The relative economic standing of the United States is declining. The Congressional Budget Office estimates that U.S. growth will average little more than 2% over the next 70 years, compared to about 3.5% during the second half of the 20th century. This is a stunning decline," close quote. Economic decline. if only relative decline, it's decline. The rise of China, the threat of radical Islam, Iran in pursuit of nuclear weapons, North Korea already in possession of nuclear weapons. Now, you spoke a moment ago about meeting with some college kids. What do you say, particularly to kids, but to any Americans who say, the wheels are coming off this project. The United States of America's best days are behind it. What do you say?
I say the wheels are a little wobbly. Let's get the lug nuts and the wrench out and fix this thing. It is fixable. But it really is, you know. We've discussed most of the main elements, most of the lug nuts we have discussed here. I personally believe they are entirely practical, and I think they are politically practical once Americans understand the facts, and in their new, I think, more sober mindset that you just described. And what I would say and do say is, if we simply get on with this, there's no country on earth I'd trade places with. America's possibilities are tremendous. Unless we allow our self-inflicted wounds to injure us too severely in the near term, in the next few years, when we can still deal with them. And so, you know, China, no, I wouldn't want China's problems. They have their demographic problems, the inevitable difficulty they'll have trying to maintain authoritarianism with rising income standards. Europe, heaven's sakes, you know, the Islamist societies are a profound danger and need to be watched, I think, and dealt with as a security threat. But they're not an economic threat. They're going to have to change dramatically ever to really rise much above where they are. So I think that Reagan comparisons are so dangerous, Reagan era comparisons. But we were in a very desperate position. Some folks have forgotten how desperate in the late 70s and in 1980. And it did take very substantial action. But having taken that action, look how we had 3 decades of fabulous success and growth. And I think that that same sort of thing is possible again, but not if we dither, not if we shrink back.
Mitch Daniels, 49th governor of the great state of Indiana, now recovering from rotator cuff surgery. Thank you very much.
Enjoyed it.
I'm Peter Robinson for Uncommon Knowledge. Thank you.